Yep, we're live.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our panel, Protecting, Decolonizing, and Radical Forms of Knowledges in the University. My name's Eve Haque, and I'm speaking to you today from the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, which is a place that is also now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples, as well as about 5,700 miles from Gaza. Welcome. Let me introduce our panel today, and let me describe the panel and what we're going to be focusing on. We're witnessing a current rise in white ethnonationalism, anti-Black, anti-indigenous, anti-Palestinian racism, queer and transphobia, and I'm going to add here quite necessarily Islamophobia. All these resulting in attacks on various areas of study, including Black, decolonizing, Indigenous and women, gender, sexuality, and trans studies, as well as those who teach them. The panelists in this teach-in will address these issues and creative forms of strategies to protect and resist the attacks on themselves, their teachings, and research. We have 5 amazing panelists today. I'm going to introduce them as they come up to speak, come up metaphorically. And our first speaker is going to be Key Alexander from the University of Toronto. Dr. Key Alexander is Assistant Professor of Gender, Sexuality, and Trans Studies and Curriculum and Pedagogy at OISE. Their current research explores pedagogies of abolitionist praxis and the lived experience of Black trans folks. Dr. Alexander's research and teaching interests include Black trans studies, abolition and transformative justice, Black feminist thought, queer Black feminist praxis, critical pedagogies, and queer trans youth of color. Their academic work is complemented by extensive community organizing experience, building advocacy programming, health education, and community for LGBTQ2S+ individuals through service roles at the University of Minnesota, Haverford College, Attic Youth Center, and the Mazzoni Center in Philadelphia. Welcome, Key.
Hello, thank you, everyone. I'm really grateful to be with you all today. I'm just going to start by saying that I had originally some remarks prepared that I kind of threw out the window and started over again because it feels politically important to focus on what's happening in Gaza and in Palestine. And so I wanted to think about, I wanted to think about that. And so bear with me as I'm kind of taking this on a little bit more impromptu than I originally planned. But, I've been thinking lately that right now when I'm thinking about movements and struggles for justice, particularly around these kind of like attacks that we're facing as scholars and as people in the world, that I find myself in a new position. I find myself in a position where most of the organizing I have done has been within the context of a group that is being oppressed that I am a part of, right? So, most of my organizing has been around Black liberation struggles, queer and trans struggles, and as a Black, queer, and trans person, I'm in those communities. Directly standing up for things that impact me directly. Now, we can make a lot of arguments that what's happening in Gaza does impact us directly, all of us. But I think right now I'm navigating this new position to being called in solidarity in a new way, to be called in solidarity in a movement that I'm not necessarily the target in. Just sitting with the reality of what that means. And so something I've been thinking about is, as an education professor, as somebody who's thinking about education as a tool for liberation, I'm having these conversations with my students around when tension shows up in communities that have been marginalized, right? So for example, I'm a scholar from the States. When I was thinking about, for example, tensions in Black and Asian American communities during, COVID, one of the tensions that was happening in communities, the kind of not necessarily anecdote, but the way that I kind of went to approach it was thinking about, okay, how do we focus on the ways that these communities have been in solidarity together? And what are the ways that we have had common interests, shared struggle, and use that as a point of relationality to kind of think about how are we going to address these tensions between our two communities that are both systematically impacted by white supremacy. And so I've been thinking about that, like turning to the places of solidarity that have already existed for us to find common struggle. And so, for example, I've been thinking about Black freedom struggle in the US, particularly, and the ways in which, particularly during the uprisings of the past decade, I guess we'll say, thinking about particularly about Ferguson, thinking about Palestinian solidarity with activists on the ground in Ferguson, about learning what it, for Americans, learning what it means to be occupied in the places that they lived with military occupations, and the solidarity that Palestinians offered at that moment, not just kind of understanding larger freedom struggles, right? Understanding how US white supremacy is not just something that impacts US citizens, but also is like a global node of imperialism, and where that shows up. I also think about, I did my PhD in Minneapolis during the uprisings after George Floyd's murder in 2020. And I just think about the ways that I have been forever changed from the sound of helicopters, witnessing National Guard with assault rifles on our corners, in our streets, casually, just being in a way that was terrifying for a lot of people. And I know how that has impacted me on an emotional and spiritual level. And so I can find solidarity and just like shared fear and grief around, the scale that I can't even imagine that's happening in Gaza. So I'm thinking about how US imperialism has impacts all over the world. As an abolitionist, I'm also thinking about the ways in which the carceral state in North America is deeply connected to what's happening in Gaza, particularly because the US military is funding the Israeli military, right? We have shared police trainings, the struggle for Cop City outside of Atlanta, where the government is trying to create basically a training ground for police that are taking the tactics that the IDF uses in Israel against Palestinians currently, to practice those on US citizens, to practice that on Black US citizens particularly. And thinking about how testing weapons. I'm also someone who's Puerto Rican, and I think about the U.S. military using Vieques as a site for testing military, bombs, military weapons, all these things, and how that has had these impacts on people, whether they are involved in these conflicts or not, right? And so I thinking as an abolitionist, thinking about the carceral state and how that impacts all of us, I think that's another node to be connecting with the fight for Palestinian freedom. And then I think the most recent thing that I've been hearing a lot is about queer and trans struggles. Now, there's been this rhetoric kind of going around saying, like, how can you be pro-Palestinian if queer and trans people are not supported there, as if the US and Canada support queer and trans people, as if the US and Canada are not actively creating legislation to erase the existence of queer and trans people. So I think it's important to think about the way that pinkwashing is used to kind of paint the picture that some places are worth our care more than other places because of the kind of performance of politics and the kind of performativity of LGBTQ acceptance. But the reality is that there is an anti-queer sentiment everywhere, in Israel, in the US, in Canada. And that creates a kind of picture around, thinking about whose grief and whose pain gets to be prioritized in these moments, right? And I think we're seeing a lot of rhetoric that is deeply dehumanizing across the board, not just for Palestinians, but also for the people who support Palestinians and support Palestinian freedom. And so I think, some of the things that I have been trying to do as a teacher, as an educator, has been to model a different kind of humanization process, right? When I think about I'm trying to teach my students how to humanize themselves in order to not dehumanize other people, because when you dehumanize yourself, it's much easier to do that to others. And, I was speaking with a friend who is saying that, the reality is that we have to actually reconceptualize what we mean about humanizing people, because a lot of what we're seeing happening is the way that people kind of believe humanity works, right? And that has actually not been in the interest of freedom. And so for me, I'm thinking about the ways that, I try to exemplify the ways that my students at the university is not the be all end all, right? And so, I'm going to tell my students, it's been a really, really hard week. Take your time getting that paper in. If you've been activated from our discussions in class, please take care of yourself, step out of the room, do these things that prioritize you being a real person and not just part of this larger machine. And when I kind of give, and it seems like little things, but I think particularly my Black and Brown Indigenous students, my queer and trans students are constantly repeating back to me the ways that they feel dehumanized in the university, as just kind of cogs in a machine, is a number amongst many. And so how do I prioritize that relationality and prioritize ways of teaching and ways of being with each other that actually prioritize, there's a way to be human in a different way that we've learned. And I know for me that what has gotten me into these larger struggles for justice, particularly around, Black, queer, and trans struggles, has also been the relationships that I have built with other comrades, right? And so, having Palestinian folks in my life who I love dearly, who are hurting, having lots of Jewish comrades who are anti-Zionists, who are also, hurting because their pain is being weaponized against another community. I think I've just been thinking about the ways that I have often dehumanized myself in trying to survive these conflicts, right? The things that I've seen in my own experience in the US, and that can lead to a lot of fear and pain. And so I guess I'll just close my remarks with kind of saying that we're all connected to these struggles. We've said it a million times, especially in the last couple of weeks, none of us are free unless we're all free. Our liberation is bound with one another. And I think we really need to take that to heart, and not just our political work, but also our work as humans, and our work as humans who have been often pushed out of the category of what human is, right? And I say that, as racialized scholars, queer and trans scholars, Indigenous scholars, right? We are often left out of the white supremacist picture of what a human is supposed to be. And so I think by prioritizing our own humanity and rethinking that and teaching our students, in the context of the university, but also in the work that we do in the world, can really help us kind of combat this dehumanizing rhetoric, and help us get us closer to freedom. So those are my musings. I appreciate you going with my ramblings, but I'm looking forward to hearing from the other panelists, and making connections and the conversation we'll have together.
Thank you so much, Kay. What a great way to start our panel. I really appreciate what you shared with us. Our next panelist, I'm very excited to hear from as well. Our next panelist is Dr. Megan Scribe. She is Inuit Iskwao and from the Norway House Cree Nation. She is also an interdisciplinary Indigenous feminist researcher, writer, and educator. Megan Scribe is Assistant Professor in the Department of Sociology and Education, as well as the Director for the Yellowhead Institute at Toronto Metropolitan University. Her scholarship and community-based advocacy exposes and interrogates interlocking structures of power and oppression, giving rise to white settler societies like Canada. Please join me in welcoming Megan.
If you'll just bear with me while I pull up my screen. Okay, and I'm going to present. And if I could just get a thumbs up from my panelists. Okay, great. Thank you so much for the introduction, Eve and Key. If those are your ramblings, I'm just going to log out right now because there's just no hope. But thank you. I really appreciated the tone you set for the panel, and I'll do my best to meet your energy. So as you can see, the kind of, I guess, my talk as part of the panel is called "I Want My Orange Shirt Back: Universities in the Era of Truth and Reconciliation." And I think what I mean by this is that I'm really exhausted by performative allyship. I'm really exhausted by the ways in which the language of indigeneity, decolonization has been taken up to fuel this EDI machine, and in many ways has defanged Indigenous, anti-colonial and land back movements. And so that's kind of my starting place. So, hi everyone. Like Eve shared, my name is Megan Scribe. I know a lot of folks on the panel, and for the most part, I just want to pretend that it's just us having this like intimate conversation. But in the back of my head, the braver part of me is really glad we're having this conversation with our larger communities, and so I won't be too afraid. Believing that we're all here because we really care about dismantling systems of power and oppression that harm our communities. I'm Inuit. I'm from Norway House Cree Nation, and I'll say more about that in a minute. So this is the prompt that I was invited to speak about, and so I'm going to focus mostly on my observations and my experiences as an Indigenous feminist scholar working in a university. I'm going to focus on my experiences in the classroom, within the university more broadly, and then my experiences as a scholar within a university in the broader public, if that makes sense. So it's kind of like a nesting doll approach I'm going to take. I think it's important for me to provide some context. So where I come from and where I live really matter in my thinking about anti-indigeneity in the university and pushing back against it. I think a lot of us are familiar with the phrasing that we are in the era of truth and reconciliation. And we have seen that play out in a number of material ways in the Canadian context. So one of the ways is land acknowledgements. So many events, many gatherings will begin with land acknowledgements. These are not new. They've been around well beyond the last 10 years, but gained widespread traction with the release of the TRC report and the calls to action. This was a really important political move that in many ways has become a performative gesture. Even still, I do want to acknowledge the radical roots of what it means to know the ground you're standing on and the caretakers of that ground. Another materialization of this context is mandatory courses. I want to acknowledge the Indigenous students who led the way in pushing for this systemic change at universities. So it was the students, Indigenous students at the University of Winnipeg, Lakehead University and Trent University, who pushed to make those universities the first to implement Indigenous course requirements. There's designated hires. Again, this is often explicitly linked to TRC's calls to action, and it's described as an act of institutional reconciliation. So often when I'm invited to more official events by the university, I'm often introduced as explicitly a diversity hire. And so all my other qualifications and my expertise take a back seat in order for the university to present me as an example of how good it's doing in terms of responding to the calls to action. And then finally, ethnic fraud. What lately is the slang term being pretendianism. So with the colonial politics of recognition in the era of truth and reconciliation, what we see are greater material incentives, many of which I just named, so designated hires, awards, there's social recognition tied to being a professional Indigenous person. And this is fraudster bait. So most Indigenous peoples are not actually able to access these material incentives. So for example, designated hires, that is extended to PhD candidates who are Indigenous. There are very few Indigenous peoples who have attained that level of education. And then of course, it comes with the expectation that you'll complete this degree within 2 or 5 years. Even PhD candidates cannot do that. There's a high attrition rate among all PhD candidates in the first place. So the people who are most likely to access these material incentives that were ostensibly created for Indigenous peoples, Indigenous people mostly cannot access it. And then it's usually ethnic fraudsters who claim those incentives. And I think just bringing it back to the point about context in terms of where I live and where I'm from a northern remote First Nation community in Western Canada. I come from a place where with a high racialized Indigenous population and a place where, at least in the 90s until more recently, it was cleaved along white and Indigenous lines. There wasn't a visible racialized community where I'm from in the 90s and early 2000s. So it was really like you're white or you're Native. And there was a real dehumanization of Indigenous peoples where I'm from. And that persists today. So there is barely concealed hostility, and this has been life-threatening and life-taking, and we've seen this through the loss of Indigenous young peoples like Tina Fontaine, and their killers have gone acquitted and have not been called to any form of justice. So that's where I'm from. And I live in a place where being Indigenous is highly romanticized. Again, it comes with barely concealed hostilities and resentments because Indigenous peoples are seen as romantic and revered in all of these places. And, I think there's this like, why them and not us kind of feeling that comes up. And so I'm constantly straddling these two contexts in my thinking around settler colonialism in Canada. But yeah, so I want to get now to talking about kind of my experiences in the classroom. So it's been a mixed experience. I think I've been met with overwhelming positivity and warm feedback. I've also been met with a lot of resistance and frustration. I think that my experience in the classroom is informed by a few things. One is that I don't teach Indigenous studies courses mostly. I mostly teach liberal studies courses, gender and sexuality, queer sociology. And so there isn't an explicit Indigenous studies I guess, foundation to the course. It's part of it, of course, but it's not the main thing. I think my experience in the classroom is also informed by the fact that TMU has this incredibly diverse student population. So 48% of the students are racialized, 55% of the students are women, 7% identify as disabled, and there's 8% students who identify somewhere along the 2S LGBTQIA plus spectrum. And I think all of those experiences that the students bring into the classroom have made for really nuanced, rich, and deep conversations. I should also add, though, that in my university, there is a 1% Indigenous student population, and that has also informed my experience in the classroom, and certainly the 1% of Indigenous students at the university. And so I just kind of outlined some of the feedback that I've observed over the years. So, what the fuck? A lot of students are horrified to learn that settler colonialism persists in Canada. We're sold the narrative that colonialism is a sad chapter of Canada's history. And so they are frustrated, they're angered, they feel lied to by all of their educators prior to this moment, because for a lot of my students, my classroom is the first place they're learning about anti-indigeneity and settler colonialism today. A lot of students are surprised and intrigued to learn about the linkages between anti-Blackness and xenophobia with anti-indigeneity, settler colonialism, and how empire and white supremacy cradle all of these different forms of oppression. It's really nice to be part of those realizations and to see opportunities to work in solidarity with one another. In a less positive experience is that I've been told that I'm too much. I've received anonymous feedback that I focus too much attention on Indigenous content when the course is not explicitly about Indigenous issues. And I think this is a really powerful argument against the quote unquote fusion model that universities are pushing. Students don't want Indigenous studies with their gender and sexuality sometimes. And so when the curriculum is not explicitly Indigenous, it's the educators who bear the brunt of student resentment when that comes up. And then students have felt unsafe in my classroom. So I've been approached during office hours by a student once who felt unsafe in my classroom when I criticized Israel's policies with respect to Palestine. And that was a really frightening moment for me. I'm an untenured assistant professor. I was not on the tenure track at that point. I didn't have my PhD. And, the accusation of being an unsafe person, it really scares you. And I think for most educators, I believe most educators want to believe they're creating safe spaces and they want to believe they're supporting their students. And so the label of being unsafe, it cuts right to the heart on top of fears around your livelihood. So, that was a really powerful moment where I learned that being in solidarity with Palestinians means that you have to be precise and you have to be specific and you have to be thorough in your language, in your research, and there is absolutely no room for mistakes because the discourse and the machine of Israel's white settler colonialism has it that you have to be the perfect ally. And it's a really high standard to meet, but maybe it's an impossible standard to meet, but I guess in the process, I've had to become a better researcher and a better educator in order to try and meet this impossible standard. But that's just a little bit about the classroom. I want to talk about the wider community now, I guess. So I co-created a course. I co-teach a course with my colleague, Dr. Ray Reese. It's called SOS 576, Colonialism and Anti-Blackness. And we're both so proud of this course. We really believe, we've done like radical, provocative things in education at the university with this course. It's not often that courses are co-taught, but that's something that we insisted on, given that we each bring a unique expertise to the to the course. But when we tried to publicly promote it, we were harassed, we were belittled, and experienced soft doxing. I'm gonna wrap it up there though, and maybe we can talk about it later in discussion if we want to, but thank you so much.
Thanks, Megan. Megan, did you need a couple more minutes? That were a couple of things you wanted to throw in there at the end?
No, it's I think we'll come back to it in discussion most likely.
Okay, I'm gonna ask you for sure. Okay, thank you so much, Megan. That is super interesting, and I'm actually intrigued to see where that went with being soft docs. So we will definitely come back to that. Okay, I want to move on to our next speaker, who is Natalie Kouri-Towe, an associate professor and program director for the Interdisciplinary Studies and Sexuality program at the Simone de Beauvoir Institute at Concordia University in Montreal. Her research has been published in both academic and non-academic venues on topics related to affect theory, solidarity, kinship, queer activism, trigger warnings, gender and sexuality pedagogies, masculinity, and responses to war in the Middle East. She's got 2 books coming out, Reading the Room, Lessons on Pedagogy and Curriculum for the Gender and Sexuality Studies Classroom, as well as another book manuscript on feminist and queer solidarity under neoliberalism under the title Solidarity at Risk. Welcome, Natalie.
Thank you so much, Eve, and thank you so much to Megan and Key for your really wonderful and insightful contributions to this conversation. Just a quick clarification, I don't have 2 books coming out, just one is in progress and one is currently under review, hopefully coming out next year, but I'll send more updates soon. I wanted to just maybe situate myself a little bit more in relation to this panel, and I'll try and keep my remarks under 10 minutes, but I know that we have up to 15, so I'll try and be pithy. But I'm the descendant of 2 populations of economic migrants who came to Canada in the 1890s under the colonial expansion into the West and the project of trying to expand the Canadian nation states colonial project. My ancestors come from Eastern Europe and from the Middle East, and so I have descendants. I'm a descendant of Arabs and Jewish peoples. And so the circumstances of the current war that is ongoing are really close to heart, and they're also ones that really pull at me in my both interpersonal and domestic life, as well as my political and work-based life. The tensions right now are high, and I recognize how hard it is for most of the people that we call allies to navigate the classroom, political discourse, and their everyday life in this particular kind of climate, not only on Palestine and Israel, but also in relation to gender and sexuality, Islamophobia, and our commitment towards decolonization. And I'm really, really actually grateful that Megan and he both spoke to components of this, especially as, for example, I think about how we grapple with our complicity with the ways in which ethnic fraud is perpetuated within academia. And I'm taking also seriously this call that the panel's title draws on around protecting our work doing decolonizing and radical forms of knowledge within the university. How do we protect this work, in particular in a moment in which we are being subjected more and more to increasing forms of censorship, surveillance, things like doxing, a chilling climate in effect as the Independent Jewish Voices report from last year illustrated around people who do work on Palestine, and also the rising division of this emerging parental rights movement in Canada and rising conservative kind of trend that has been developing, especially over the last few months, but perhaps even over the last couple of years. So my focus today is going to be on how do we sustain and build our capacity to continue this work? How do we actually protect our ability to do this work in these circumstances? And this is speaking in this way at a time when it is feeling really, really hard to sustain the energy to do this work. I think I am not alone in feeling depleted and feeling worn down, worn out, feeling on the verge of tears, or actually just crying like most days. And also feeling the divisiveness within my own institution, within my relationship with my colleagues, with my students, and with people within my personal life. No one is really doing okay. People are not doing well at all. It's a very hard time to sustain our role and our complicity within systems of both domestic and international forms of violence. So how do we protect our capacity to keep working, to keep doing this work? And I think the only way to do that is to try and build our capacity to work in collaboration and work together, to break the cycle of trying to introduce divisions and resist the kind of divisive and fragmenting impulse to divide oppressed populations and communities and those who are marginalized and victimized by structures of violence, and to encourage infighting. This is a long-term strategy used by structures and systems of power, and it is certainly upon us right now. We are, I think, ripe in a moment of divisiveness. And I'm saying this in a context in which we've got pretty explicit forms of state repression that are at stake. Key has introduced and talked about the legislation that's been introduced in Saskatchewan and New Brunswick. We have indications that more governments are looking into the possibility in Canada of introducing repressive forms of anti-gender inclusive, transphobic, and homophobic legislation, specifically targeting education and healthcare. And I'm thinking here about the relationship between the work of what we do in the university with education more broadly, and the role of K-12 education and college education as part of a larger web of thinking about the role of our position within universities to both sustain our capacity to do critical work, but also to build our broad-based capacity to protect the rights of people who are marginalized within the context of education. If the United States is any indication of what is to come next, universities will be the next target. And it won't just be gender and sexual minorities in Canada, it will be many other people. Indeed, in Quebec, we've seen the targeting of Muslims and other religious minorities under Bill 21, and the effect of this has been long-term forms of increased Islamophobia, harassment, and racializing violence. And the effect of that is not only on the experiences of Muslim communities, but also an increasing polarization around the relationship and trust that people who are marginalized feel in relation to education. So creating a space in which education is a place where parents face and confront systemic racism amplifies a sense of experiences, amplifies the experience of violence that parents experience, as well as their children through education, and makes education a place that's more dangerous for them and their children. It's in this context that I think the parental rights movement in Canada has captured the minds and the emotions and the energies of Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities across the country. It's not just that we have the circumstances and environment where we've got rising right-wing politics and increasing conservatism in the far right rhetorics around mistrust of government and conspiratorial thinking, but that the larger context of economic insecurity, precarity, and living through a pandemic in which none of us were prepared for, and none of us know how to navigate the continued circumstances around, has led to people feeling very unsafe in their everyday lives. And the thing that we do know historically is that feelings of unsafety and insecurity, feeling targeted by certain aspects of mainstream society, amplify the kind of conservative political and ideological attachments that people might be susceptible to. So how do we protect our capacity to do this work in the university? I think that we need opposition, but alongside opposition, we need something that is very hard to do, and particularly in this kind of political moment. And that is the work of de-escalation. De-escalation is an approach to reducing the effects of harm and violence in a circumstance in which the ending of that form of harm or violence is not feasible in the immediate present. It means reducing exposure and amplifying the capacity of people to survive circumstances of inequity, violence, oppression, marginalization, and expulsion. It also means building broader bases of support, drawing on our capacities to build coalition, to build bridges, and to work with others that we might not feel to be natural allies to us alongside our work of doing oppositional politics. So in particular, what this looks like, it means doing some pretty hard things. It means having conversations with people we might not want to have, having conversations that will make us uncomfortable, finding our capacity to both withstand those difficult and uncomfortable conversations alongside our commitment to the ethical and political projects of ending violence. It means working to fight the attempts to continuously censor work on Palestine and support for Palestinians by mobilizing and using the rhetoric of flattened hierarchies and weaponizing notions of safety. So we see this happen. I mean, this is a long-term strategy that's been used as a way to try and silence and condemn criticism of the state of Israel. But in particular, the use of the feeling of unsafety and insecurity. And I think, Megan, what you described in your experience is something that is quite common across the board for scholars globally who speak about Palestine and are critical of the Israeli state, is that people feeling uncomfortable about criticism of a nation state mobilize that feeling of discomfort in the language of safety and security. And we've made this possible in gender and sexuality studies by the flattening of the way that we use concepts like intersectionality that tend to equate different forms of positionality and social location as equivalent rather than as part of systems and structures of power and violence. So we have a responsibility, I think, in making sure that we develop in our classrooms as well as in our larger communities a more complex and rich engagement with the core concepts of intersectionality, which are intrinsic to the concepts theorization and political mobilization, that our feelings of discomfort are not the same as experiences of harm, that being uncomfortable is something that we have to develop our capacity to withstand and to survive, but that doesn't mean that we are victimized by feeling uncomfortable, that we have moral and ethical responsibilities to take stands in opposition to violence, and that opposition to violence does not have to be dictated by the dominant discourses perpetuated in public discourse that have been mainstreamed. So, for example, the attempts to create triangulation or hollow debates around positionality undermine our capacity to build our relationship of collaboration and our capacity to work together to end structures and systems of violence. So attempts to, for instance, undermine people's attempts or capacity to build solidarity around gender inclusive projects by mobilizing languages around the inherent homophobia of Islamic culture or communities has actively undermined our capacity in Canada to respond to parental rights discourses that have been used as justification for attacking human rights in education more broadly. The use of notwithstanding clauses in Canadian law through the provinces, undermining of our human rights codes in order to advance, laws that attack people's human rights, like what Bill 21 did in Quebec and what the parental rights movement has been doing now, illustrate a tactic that is now effective and will be used and amplified more and more. So we need people to be able to work together and be able to explain to one another why it is more complicated to simply, okay, it's more, well, I don't know how to phrase this. It's more complicated than simply seeing things as oppositional sides. We all have a role and a responsibility to understand our co-implication within structures and systems of violence, which means that we have to understand, for instance, when we talk about parental rights, that the types of concerns that Muslim and immigrant families are expressing have to do not only with their discomfort around the potential focus on learning about sexuality and gender in our society, but also about the feeling of invalidation that parents experience through education. The fact that our education system doesn't produce culturally sensitive information or materials about sex education curriculum, that Islamophobic tropes are deployed in the way that we talk about sexual rights globally, and that these need to be addressed in our education system. At the same time, within our universities, we need to address the ways in which the discourses of political rhetoric that are used in order to sustain militarization in Israel are mobilized in the deployment of a debate type structure in talking about the rights of Palestinians and Israelis, in which Jewish students feel that they have to defend the state of Israel, and Palestinian students are made to feel that they're responsible for forms of violence enacted in their name. And the reality is that we have collective responsibility to mobilize and encourage and demand that our governments intervene in a system and structure that has both profited off of war industries and also benefited from the continued international relations that have allowed for the continuation of state violence to be enacted. The only solution to any of these conflicts is a commitment to building equity, equality, peaceful structures that oppose violence through demilitarization, through decolonization, and through the institution of fair and equal forms of participation. We need to be careful about how divisive rhetoric is mobilized at the university within our communities, and we need to amplify our capacity to work together in circumstances like the ones we face today. It can't be just the people who are directly experiencing forms of harm who are speaking out against that harm. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Natalie. That was really great. It speaks directly to the moment that we're in. And I want to introduce our next speaker, who's Evelyn Aransa. She's an adjunct professor at University of Toronto and also a community organizer, researcher, scholar, and co-founder of the Black Graduate Students Collective at York University. She has been an integral part of the struggle for Black studies at York and also works on decolonizing the academy, both in Ghana and in Toronto, and advocates for more representation of Black people in the academy. Her work is largely on melancholia and race and critiques of the post-racial. She is interested in Afro-pessimism, Black studies, diaspora studies, social and political critiques of whiteness, popular culture, and cultural studies. Her work is motivated by Robin D.G. Kelly's phrase, love, study, struggle. Welcome, Evelyn.
Thanks, Eve. Thank you, everyone who has shared before me. I have so many notes, so I'm excited for the conversation we're going to have after. And so I'll try to be brief in my remarks. I want to start off by saying that I am extremely disappointed in, I think, the silence from colleagues and from faculty over the last couple of weeks. And while being disappointed, I'm not surprised, because I think that what I've seen historically as an activist, a student activist within the community, is that we have already betrayed our voices that therefore don't allow us to use them in moments when it's most important. And so I kind of want to start there. I also want to bring in Before I get to strategies, I've been thinking mainly about the limitations to those strategies, the things that actually limit our abilities to be creative in creating strategies of protection and resistance. So the first limitation that I want to talk about is Black middle class dreams, or the ways in which the newfound positions within academy that are for people who come from disenfranchised, poor, lived realities become contradictory to the work that we do when they are incorporated into the university in these middle class ways. And so these positions, and not just within the university, also outside of the universities, we're seeing a lot of these programs, these strategies that are for Black people and that are ultimately run by Black people with Black people in leadership. But these positions come with paychecks and power, but they also come with histories of silence, oppression, and disenfranchisement. And these two things are entangled together. When we show up in these positions, we are also showing up with these histories where we have come from not having. And I think that while it's important that we take up these roles and these lived realities are the reasons why, these lived experiences are the reasons why we take up these roles, there are unreconciled and unresolved histories of oppression and poverty that mean that we often are working with a scarcity mentality. We are given a middle class dream by becoming faculty, by becoming professors, and we can actually work. The way that we work can be implicated by our need to protect that middle class piece of the pie. That pie might not be super delicious. It might not be, as filling, right? But something about that, we are asked to protect that piece of the pie, and we are driven to do it because we come from these scarce histories and experiences, and so. This limits how we can show up. It limits how you can show up when you're trying to protect your piece of the pie that you never had, that pie that you never had, that you were never supposed to have. So while we have our theories and we are equipped with, and we dive into and want to our lives to reflect and our values, when we are in these kinds of positions, we are already compromised. We're compromised from the beginning. And that being compromised means that, there's already a betrayal of your voice when there isn't an intentional thinking of that contradiction within our contracts. There isn't an intentional thinking of these contradictions within the work that we do. I think many of us think that we can take on these positions and maintain our morals and our values and our this and our that, but it's almost not possible if you're not intentionally thinking of the mechanisms that are going to allow you to reconcile those contradictions. So that's the first thing that I wanted to talk about. I wanted to also talk about the weaponization of collegiality and how that also is a limit to our ability to protect ourselves, because we are told that when we are trying to hold our colleagues, friends, other folks accountable, particularly in these academic spaces, that we are not being collegial, right? And what being collegial it ultimately does, it silences and it's protecting white fragility, it's protecting white people mostly. It's protecting it's this notion that is about like, how do we make sure we're all cool in this space, as if that's our job. Is to be cool with everybody, like don't burn bridges, etc. When we should be burning lots of bridges, actually. We should be holding our colleagues accountable. And that actually is what collegiality is, because we are in these spaces to usher in, to ensure there's change. This is why many of us are hired. This is why the university has these programs. I mean, yes, they are diversity hires. And, a colleague was reminding me about how sometimes the university refers to the race for Black studies, the race for Indigenous studies, right? Like there's this competition amongst universities hiring for clout, right? Like it's not about what we think it's about when we take on these positions, but there's something else going on. But ultimately, the ways in which this language of collegiality becomes very limiting in our ability to think of strategies that allow us to protect ourselves. And then I want to talk about academic freedom. And I want to talk about it because that is supposed to be the thing for academics that allows for creativity and for action. It's supposed to be part of the mechanisms that exist. I do talk a lot about mechanisms, but it's supposed to be the mechanism that exists to allow for us to be able to be creative. And it's supposed to be the thing that, so today we're talking about what we do in order to protect ourselves when there is actually there's already something that's established historically, including unions and so on and so forth that are supposed to, that means I'm not supposed to think about how I protect myself. There's already a strategy and there's already strategies that exist for me to be able to protect myself. But we have watered down and compromised and betrayed academic freedom historically. And so it's not a surprise that today it becomes a question in moments of extreme, in moments where it's the most meaningful, that it becomes this question. We've already watered it down and betrayed what it's supposed to mean and do historically. And so it's actually not a surprise that it's coming up in the way that it's coming up today. And so I think for me, and that betrayal of academic freedom, particularly when I think about Black studies and I think about the work that many of us are doing, is connected to that first piece that I was talking about, which is like the need to protect some of our materialities, because that means that every day when we show up to the classroom, to faculty meetings, to wherever the spaces are, every day we're asked to actually betray that a little bit more and more and more. So when we're not practicing it in these moments where there aren't crisis and just regular daily academic life, I actually do not see an ability for us to activate it in moments when we actually need to be able to do that because there is more of a threat that is looming. And so when I think about strategies, I go back to this question of what limits those strategies. And I struggle with, I struggle with it because I just know that when the things that we don't do every day to day, we're not going to be able to do in times of crisis. We've not practiced. We don't know how to employ them. And so it is as simple as my strategy, I should say, is that every time I feel like I'm betraying my voice, my students, my politics, my something, I try to hold myself accountable. So because I know that there's going to be moments where I'm going to need to, it's going to be scarier for me to do it. And if I can't do it in moments where there aren't looming threats, how am I going to do it in moments when there is a looming threat? And so while academic freedom, like for me, what I would like to see is a return to academic freedom practice in daily academic life and just practice regularly, so that we know how to activate it in moments of threat and of crisis. And I think I'll just stop there. And I'm looking forward to the conversation I'm going to have with the rest of my panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Evelyn. And I'm so glad for all your comments, particularly ending on academic freedom. I'm going to talk a lot more about that later today in the closing panel. So, and I think everything you say is a great jumping off point for us to think about. I want to introduce our last speaker, who's Chadne Desai, an assistant professor at the University of Toronto. She's working on her first book, Revolutionary Circuits of Liberation, Palestinian Resistance, Culture, and Internationalism. She has been involved in the Palestine Solidarity Movement for the past 15 years and has organized with many grassroots groups locally and transnationally. And I just want to add that Chadne was also organized a fantastic teach-in at University of Toronto last week. Thank you, Chadne, and welcome.
Oh, hi, everybody. First, I just want to say it's such an honor and pleasure to be in conversation with friends and comrades. All of you are so dear to me, and it's, to come and do a panel right now, it's very difficult, and to be among friends feels the right way to do it, and I guess people can watch our conversation. Thank you for all the comments that have been raised. And I also look forward to our conversation. Usually I never bring an emotion in a kind of particular way to any kind of panel, because as Megan described, right, when you do the work on Palestine, you have to be precise, you have to be specific, and you have to be thorough. And so there's no room for the other stuff, the affect. But today I am going to bring in the affect a little bit, because 5,000 people, maybe 6, the number is just changing. 2,000 children. My heart is there. And in the last 2 days, I've had to actually slow down a little bit from working and organizing. And because while the moment calls for that, the moment also calls for me to really think deeply about my comrades and my friends, my loved ones, especially in Palestine, and my loved ones around the world. Because Palestine is not about just the geography of Palestine. It is a struggle that is deeply so important to people around the world, and Palestinians live across the world. So I want to start with the words of my dear ones and my friends right now that are trapped in the colony. I read from them first, and then I'll get into my thoughts on all of the things that we're trying to think about today. They say, "We are all Palestinians. 2013 will be recorded historically as the year that Palestinians stood bloody in the face of colonial fascism and screamed in defense of their homes, humanity, and life. Palestinians as a people have endured over a century of settler colonial violence. We have thrived as a people and shall continue to do so. We do not need to speak of our right to resist, for it is not a right, but a way of being and survival for Palestinians. Zionism, the settler state, and the entire colonial system that is a product of this fascist ideology can no longer falsely hide beneath the cloak of humanism. In Palestine in 2023, we do not demand our right to narrate. Our ability to narrate was never out of our hands, and resistance in all of its manifestations and forms do not need the pre-approval of static international law codes. The oppressed do not need to claim authority over their oppression. The ongoing events of history, our history, is what allows us this authority. We consider it our duty not to expose the bloody barbarism of Zionism. Their actions as a fascist state and a ruthless army are more than sufficient to undertake this task. It is our duty to record this moment, not as its victims, but as the people who will remember, record, survive, and resist it." I want to start here because as there's, rightfully so, there's a McCarthyist backlash that is happening right now in this country and in many countries around the world on pro-Palestinian speech. And many, many people are being targeted, harassed, doxxed, threatened. This is actually the reality for Palestinians and their allies that do this work, whether it's in the academic realm or whether it's in political activism or whether it's just a means of survival. And so in some senses, while this moment, of course, and it should bring attention to the mass apparatus, which is, of course, the Zionist lobby and its, and its impact on states and institutions like educational institutions, this is for many of us is not new. It is not new. It has been what has been the reality of the way we work across sites. And so I want to bring us kind of to a particular moment in Canada or sort of this moment in Canada we're in right now, and especially at universities, in really thinking about what is it that has been happening. And part of today I'm a bit incoherent is because there's also been a sort of interesting observation I've made from October 7th till we are in this moment. And I want to describe sort of these observations because, you know, it speaks to how we speak. Sometimes we speak for our colleagues, sometimes we speak for our trade unions, sometimes we speak for our loved ones, sometimes we speak for our students, sometimes we speak for ourselves, and sometimes we speak for history. And I think that this week, these last couple of weeks, it's been very challenging around trying to have particular kinds of conversations, because even those that understand colonial violence, racial violence, gendered violence, sexual violence, on October 7th, that went out the window. 15, 16 years of solidarity work, organizational work, and alliance, you know, and alliance building with people who we thought could be on side. There was a moment that shifted immediately. It took about 500 people to die in a massacre in a hospital to actually all of a sudden shift everyone's minds again. And I'm being really crude right now, and I'm being honest, because that comes from a place of anger, that how do people sit and listen to a corporate media that is backed by, you know, imperialist and colonial interests? How do we listen to those narratives and stomach them and actually forget the history that has been being repeated over and over again around colonialism, around apartheid, which has been proved by so many human rights organizations, and around an occupation? No matter how much, you know, people know, in a very specific moment, the conversation shifted to the tactics that an occupied and an oppressed people and a colonized people have been using. And so what has been really interesting is that the conversational entry at first has been trying to like think about, well, hi everyone, what is anti-colonialism is about? We're talking about anti-colonialism like it's some kind of, you know, EDI process. We talk about decolonization like it's some kind of let's have donuts and coffee process, right? And so part of the interventions in the first week of when things were unfolding here had to really, for me, be about bringing it back to reminding folks about what anti-colonialism really is, what decolonization is about. And if we are about those politics, then what does that mean when we think about Palestine? Why is it that Palestine becomes the exception, right? So it's not just the exception around speech in this country or elsewhere, but it also sometimes becomes the exception around thinking about the demands that an oppressed and colonized people are, wanting. And I saw that with colleagues, with the left, with, and that makes it very difficult because the messaging is confusing. On the one hand, you're trying to have this conversation, and on the other side, you have your students that are Palestinian specifically that are saying, can we have a different conversation? Can we stop having to defend our humanity? Can we have a different conversation? And I think that's the reason I started with the statement that I started, because in some senses, I have been reflecting around what is, Edward Said's notion of the permission to narrate. I've been thinking about that. And then a part of me is thinking about, well, actually, this struggle and this people has been narrating over and over and over and over again. But that might not be palatable to the ears of folks, or that might be something that folks decide to flip-flop on whenever they want. Now, I'm going to bring it back to the Canadian context because I know people might want to hear about the Canadian context and sort of the stifling of speech and what is happening right now. The last 15 years, there's been vibrant organizing that has been happening outside first of academic institutions. So one thing I want to highlight is sometimes the wins that happen, like, probably Natalie, when you and I were organizing back in the day, the kind of climate of being able to be in solidarity with Palestine across alliances was more of a grassroots thing. You wouldn't have academics that are issuing statements or sort of colleagues wanting to stand in solidarity or wanting to do something. This shift we see because of the work of anti-colonial, anti-racist movements that have brought the language of struggle from outside, from the streets, into the university, into the classrooms, and created space to have these debates, right? And I think part of one of the strengths of the boycott, divestments, and sanctions movement has been to be able to bring these points into academic associations, to be able to bring these points into the unions, whether it's at, faculty associations or in graduate student unions or unions across the country. And so what that has meant is that speech in some senses has looked a little bit different. But it is the vibrancy of this movement and the achievements it has made, particularly within academia, right? Trying to sort of have a very different starting point of talking about Palestine that has brought us to this moment in which the shift in global public opinion, whether it's in the amount of people we see marching in the streets, whether that's in coalitional alliances, which, you know, he gestured to around sort of the Ferguson Gaza link, that is one example. There's been so much solidarity and movement building that has been happening that in some senses has also contributed to shifting global public opinion, particularly in the West. And as that has happened, a network of lobby groups and think tanks, particularly Zionist and far right groups, have intensified their efforts to stifle criticism of Israel. Rather than engage such criticism on its merits, these heavily funded lobby groups have pressured universities, governments, and other institutions to censor, punish, and even persecute those that stand up for Palestinian rights and speak up against, human rights violations. In some senses, protected speech on Palestine has never been protected. In many ways, academic freedom has never been an existing framework for those of us that have been doing this work. We might use it, of course, in a strategic way as a way to get our rights and freedoms protected and the rights and freedoms of our colleagues protected and our students protected. But in some senses, this kind of protected speech has never really existed. In fact, it has been routinely been maligned for decades as anti-Semitic, as uncivil, as divisive, as supportive of terrorism. And we are seeing in this moment this kind of intensification of these languages being used in ways that then criminalize, silence, and mischaracterize the kinds of ways in which people are actually speaking up against power, against colonialism, against racial violence, against gendered violence, and are speaking for justice and peace and freedom and liberation. Of course, we're seeing this McCarthyist backlash against pro-Palestinian speech in an array of spaces, whether it's, Sarah Jama being attacked by the NDP or in the legislature, or it's, university students at York, who are facing disciplinary action. What is key is the external interference of pro-Israel lobby groups on campuses is one of the greatest threats to academic freedom, free speech, and physical safety for anyone working on Palestine or is in solidarity with Palestine. And so when we get into these free speech debates, oftentimes I have asked publicly that what are we doing about those that actually create these conditions of unsafety? What are we doing about those that are actually trying to threaten, fundamental rights that we have, whether it's in the Constitution or whether it's in it's on, in campus codes around academic freedoms, or what the purpose of the university is supposed to be. And what we know is that these lobby groups with their donor base have a major stake in the kind of knowledges that are produced. Today is about knowledge production. And what I find is knowledge production is deeply politicized and deeply, especially when it's anti-colonial knowledge production, it's deeply attacked because of the interests of those in power. So I think it's really important for us to remember that they are particular groups that are forcing our institutions to clamp down on us in particular ways. And so academic discourse is not free, and in fact, who is authorized to speak is a structural issue. Which again, Edward Said so powerfully encapsulated in 1984 in his essay Permission to Narrate, in which he argued the Palestinians are systematically denied their ability to narrate their history. And, we see that happening over and over again. Big tech companies are trying to silence social media, which is one of the only spaces where narratives from the ground are coming out. But you see a targeting of the narrative all the time in history, right? Palestinian cultural figures were attacked, assassinated. Today, we're seeing the massacre of journalists in mass. So the idea is never to have the narrative out there. It's never to have the narrative supported, and it's never to have the narrative humanized. And I guess I want to kind of move to, and then I'll of course close very quickly. how do we sustain? Because Natalie, this question you're asking is, and the question you're thinking about on sustaining is incredibly important across, you know, the different issues we've talked about. I think, I mean, I won't get into the personal attacks and all the things. It's too long. It's a book itself, you know, but I think to sustain, I really think, of course, de-escalation is a really important aspect, collaboration, a huge one, but poetry is a huge way to sustain. In trying to, one of the things that poetry has allowed is not just to be able to sit with the thoughts and emotions of what is happening, but sometimes poetry also enables us to envision the kinds of solidarities that we forget that history has given us, right? So whether it's the poetry of June Jordan and connecting that to, you know, Lee Miracle and her poem to Darwish, or whether that's Darwish's poem for those that were struggling for land in the Americas, I think that poetry is a really important site in which, when political struggles forget to remind us, or divisive moments, you know, make us fight or have infighting or oppression Olympics take place, we actually look to history to remind us of radical internationalist solidarities. And we have a whole canon of this. We have, you know, the Afro-Asian world, the tricontinental. We have all of these beautiful formations that have taught us politically, intellectually, but also poetically and culturally about the ways in which solidarity in these times was necessary, was urgent, was beautiful. And so, again, building alliances with people that are willing to do the work, that are willing to listen, that are willing to also take direction. This is a moment where people have to take direction, right? Yeah, I think that as Megan said, like, you have to be precise when you work in the struggle. You can't just say, yes, I'm in solidarity, and then not take direction, because that's also difficult in the sense that you know, that makes strategy really difficult. That makes attacks by the lobby group much more susceptible. So I think that's a couple of things. Another is fugitive spaces. Many of us that, you know, don't belong in the traditional sense, there's always fugitive spaces with each other, with students, with staff, with, you know, other folks that we can find around us, people in community. And I just want to sort of end there around fugitive spaces, in really thinking about, if we can't do, you know, the work in ways that are safe, or in ways that feel nourishing, or ways that feel that our survival and our liberation dreams can be sustained, then we go into the underground and we do it, and we bring it when we can. I guess I end with Robin Kelly's words: love, study, struggle. That's how we sustain ourselves. We love each other. We love our students. We love our people. We study fucking hard. Sorry for swearing. We are precise, we are thorough, and we are on point. And we struggle, we fight to change this world. And so those are my thoughts. And I know that all of you on this call know what that really means, because all of you are loving, struggling, and studying, both collectively with each other and with me, but also in the world. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Chadne. What an inspiring way to end the presentations. But we have some time. We have a few minutes. And I know that you wanted to ask each other some questions and have a bit of a discussion. So I'm going to throw it open to you to engage with each other. You have this space to do that. Who wants to start things off? Yeah,
I'll throw something. I know that I was like, yeah, we should have questions. So I'll take on the labor of kind of showing up to that. Thank you, everyone, for your thoughts. It was really amazing to just, hear from comrades and hear from folks that share political alignment. I have a lot of notes that don't really make any sense, but I guess one question that I would like to throw out is, I kept on hearing this conversation about safety and security. And I'm just really curious about, when we're thinking about sustaining, we're thinking about fugitive spaces, and we're thinking about what safety actually means and what it does not mean. I guess I'm curious about where safety comes into these like conversations. I guess I'll start with kind of thinking about, as somebody who, my organizing background is in transformative justice and anti-prison work, right? And I think so much of the foundation of that work was really having to learn myself, what does it mean to be safe? Who creates the conditions of being safe? And kind of what Natalie offered, like the differences between safety and discomfort, right? Or unsafety and discomfort. So for me, I think I've been thinking a lot about the ways that these kind of middle class dreams, these neoliberal dreams, have thought like, I'm a person who's coming from the US, I'm a new professor, my immigration to Canada is contingent on me working at the University of Toronto, right? And the ways that the risk of kind of like, oh, someone could pull the plug on literally my entire life and I could get, sent back to the US. And I left the US for a reason. So I'm thinking just about that, about like the precarity that comes up in this work. And I don't know that there's necessarily answers to it, but like, what are things that we feel like we need to get clear on about what safety is and what safety isn't? So I would just like love to hear people's thoughts about that and how it comes into conversation with this, with all these kind of overlapping conversations we've been having.
Thank you, Key. Natalie, I know you got something to say about that.
So much to say about it. Thank you so much, Key. I think, and thank you, Chandni and Evelyn. I mean, just it's really powerful to be in conversation with you all. I think a lot about this question, in part because I think we're in a moment that is increasingly unsafe, like in material ways. What happened at the University of Waterloo at the end of June is, a small sliver of what's been going on across Canada, which has been increasing attacks on women, gender, and sexuality studies programs. In the last few weeks, we've had incidences on our campus here in Montreal of disruption, of homophobic disruption. Last year, we had people from the public coming into our spaces, playing Andrew Tate videos. There's like all kinds of things that are happening that are meant to make people feel unsafe around gender and sexuality. And I want to really highlight the way in which the rising far right and conservative politics that are being mobilized really requires immediate and urgent attention, because the more that those discourses circulate, the more they intensify forms of divisiveness that accelerate circumstances of violence that target people who are the most vulnerable and most marginalized. And I mean here in particular that, homophobic, sexist, transphobic, and invalidating language is deeply connected to Islamophobia and to anti-Semitism, but that there are people who are targets of those forms of violence who get mobilized in opposition to one another in ways that are strategically useful for the interests of conservative political projects in both Canada as well as internationally. And it's important for us to be able to actively identify and resist those, so resisting the ways in which anti-Semitism and Islamophobia are centered into sexuality and gender discourses, resisting anti-Semitic discourses in Palestine solidarity movements or in support of Muslim and other racialized and immigrant communities in Canada, resisting the ways in which sexism comes to dominate particular kinds of political moments, and the integration of cross-interest-based, cross-experience-based oppression analysis is important in this moment in order for us to actually address the questions of safety and unsafety. At the same time, we have to develop really much better, more sophisticated ways of identifying the difference between our psychic trauma and structural forms of violence and harm. So we can experience both psychic harm from structural harm, but also from just interpersonal harm. I mean, and that is not something to discount. We need to be attentive in our movements to the ways in which we are subjected to forms of psychological harm on mass scales that we don't have resources or tools to grapple with. And in the name and experience of collective experiences of harm, both through structural systems, but also interpersonal relationships, a lot of violence is done in the name of our experiences of trauma. And one of the things we know from gender-based research on violence is that violence is cyclical, that people who experience violence reenact violence laterally. And that requires us to pay attention to that. And so, you know, a lot of people who are doing transformative justice work are talking about healing. It's something that I know very little about and feel is more urgent than ever to kind of figure out. But it's hard, and it's hard when people are hurting to be able to tap into separating out what's a form of hurt that is attached to our own wounds that are part of structures of violence, and what are the wounds that we carry that are just inherited from cycles of violence.
Thank you so much, Natalie. We're running out of time, but I do want to give Evelyn, she's had her hand up, a chance to just comment.
I'll try to be really quick, because I think Key brought up sort of like humanizing your students in class as well. And I think that I've been thinking about how the more we try to be safe, that turns into us just ultimately sometimes doing the dehumanization of ourselves, because the moments where I feel the most human are when I'm using my voice, when I do feel afraid and I'm still able to do that. And I think that there's this like these neoliberal narratives about protect yourself, protect your mental health, protect this and protect that. Not to say those things are not important, but when that's where like we're stuck, protecting our individuality, our mental health, our so on and so forth, we're less in connection with other people. We're less doing the things that are human. Like those are the things that are human, is to be in connection. And so I think that I've been really trying to reconcile that being safe with not betraying my own humanity, so that like so like, and what does that look like? Because yes, there is a risk involved, but in so many ways, when we're being risk adverse, that is a betrayal of our own humanity, because then the things that we have decided are human, we're being distracted from some of the very core pieces of what it means to be human, which is our ability to connect. And so I've just been trying to sort of reconcile that, and I wanted to put that on the table, even though we don't have time to talk too much about it.
Thank you so much, Evelyn. Yes, it's amazing how we've run out of time, but that's because this has been an incredible panel. A lot to think about, and a lot of connections. I really appreciate all your contributions, and it's been a real honor being able to facilitate and chair this session. I know our conversations will continue, and I hope we will all be meeting with each other and other folks and continuing this conversation. Thank you so much for a great panel.